Hello again, everybody. My name is John D. Healy. My podcast is called It's Good to Talk. People know me because I produced this book, and that's how it all started. But my friend Tony McGurn, his life story from 1941 up to present, and sponsored by Liffey Van Lines here in New York, and they've been around longer than Jeopardy. I always have special guests on, and today is no exception. He's Gerry Coyle. He's from Geesal in County Mayo, my home county. So it's a privilege and an honour for me to have Gerry Coyle on, someone from my home place. Remember, I did have Philip Irwin, and I did have Seamus Caulfield, if you want to go look at old podcasts. Now, hello, Gerry, and you're welcome to New York via the technology. Hello, Gerry, and let's talk about you.
It's absolutely wonderful to be on and speaking to New York all the way from Geesala. Laxad is the nearest point of land, I think, in Ireland to New York, so we're in the next panel.
Very good. So, Gerry, what we were dealing with today is this wonderful production of a book all about your father. I have read through it, and it's a fine, and you should be very, very proud of yourself and all the research and work that has gone into it, because it's a lot of work. It's really a lot of work. So tell me, your father was born in Geesala, I assume?
He was born in Midordan, just outside Geesala, back towards the village of New York. He was born there in 1894, we think.
Okay.
So he grew up in abject poverty, as did everybody in this area at the time. It was the most deprived area in the country, and there was mass immigration to America and to Canada and to England and everything. And he was over in Scotland with his father from once he reached the age of 13. Some of your listeners might know the totty hawkers or the totty pickers. They used to pick the potatoes on the fields in Scotland for the farmers. Slavish work, poorly paid. And he'd done that from the age of 13 until he was about 17. And then a lot of the Irish people stopped because some of them were afraid they'd be conscripted into the English army that went to fight in the World War. So they didn't go then for a few seasons.
Right.
And that's how he grew up. And, there was a big movement towards Irish independence at the time. And he got himself involved. How he got involved first, he went to prevent an eviction in 1918 down in Dula of a woman who was to be evicted from her home, and 3 of her children had died with the Spanish flu of 1918, 17 flu. And he got in what the papers described as a fracas with members of the RIC who came to enforce the eviction order. And a few days later, he was arrested, taken to Belmullet, and he was sent to Sligo jail for his troubles. They called it a charge of an illegal assembly, it was called.
Right.
So from there, his life became hectic, I suppose, to describe it.
Well, he's involved, obviously, at that point.
He became heavily involved in, how he met Michael Collins first. I haven't been able to establish the first time he met him. But whether it was somebody in Sligo jail that introduced him or people. But the man that went to Sligo jail came out more radicalised than ever. And before long, he was a member of the Volunteers. And the next known fact I know about him, he swam people into the IRA in Scotland.
Okay.
So that's how he started his career, I suppose, or his...
The woman that was being evicted, that house was in Dula, and for my listeners here, Dula is only a few miles from Geesala.
Oh, yeah, also, right down the road from where we settled ourselves.
Yeah, from Geesala. And I read in the book as well, in Henry said he recognises that Geesala is a beautiful place, like gorgeous scenery and everything. But to quote your Henry Coyle, your dad, he says, scenery won't put food on the table.
No, and it never did.
Mother Teresa quotes, as Mother Teresa used to say, a million Hail Marys won't build a church.
No.
You need to be able to... Yeah, go ahead.
They were brought up in abject poverty, but he was very lucky because his mother could read and write, which was very unusual from the famine generation, that she was able to read and write. And he would have left school at 12 or 13 himself. But she seemed to have been a major influence on his life.
Right.
And I suppose it was that major influence that gave him great respect for women, even women in the freedom movement. He always referred to the women doing their bit as well. But to take the story on, he arrives in Scotland, and very soon he's linked up with Michael Collins' right-hand man there. Now, people may wonder how all the ammunition and the guns and gelignite and everything was sourced in Scotland, but there was a huge Irish contingent working in the mines, and they'd go down the mines every day, and some of them were charge hands, and they'd order more gelignite than was needed, and it would be shipped to Ireland. And some of the workers brought up a stick of gelignite in their Wellington every night, and they'd gather it up in one place. And he became the chief gunrunner in Scotland for a number of years before he was caught. The stuff was transferred to Liverpool. They used to send it across from Scotland to Belfast and then bring it down. It always went to be at Dublin. And in Liverpool, there was a man by the name of Neil Kerr, whose family has made contact with me since his descendants as has several other people. And the stuff was sent to Liverpool, and then it was shipped across because he was working in the docks there and working in there. Neil Kerr was, and he stuff across to Ireland. And my father became the chief gunrunner of the whole thing in that period, from 1919 till he was caught in 1920. He was caught in 1920, as I said. But before he was caught, your listeners will remember that there was a major incident in Dublin where the Black and Tans shot people in Croke Park.
Oh yeah, Bloody Sunday.
20th of November 1920. And now people say it was in retaliation. The group of IRA men, being led by Kerr, and they went down and they burned 18 warehouses in the docks in Liverpool. But some people call retaliation, but in actual fact, it was planned for some time before that I have discovered in my research. He was buying paraffin. Every time the car would go from Scotland to Liverpool with a load of gelignite, they'd go around and they were buying paraffin from the 15th. So it was 5 days before the shooting in Dublin, actually.
Right.
And two sisters from Cork, who were never mentioned in any other publication, bought all the paraffin that was used to burn in warehouses.
Wow.
And that event in Liverpool had a major effect on bringing the British government to the negotiating table.
Right.
And I suppose people say to me, did anything surprise you? Well, a lot of stuff surprised me, but the most thing that surprised me, how untrained and inexperienced soldiers brought the might of the British Empire to the negotiating table.
Right.
They were negotiated by untrained and inexperienced negotiators. I think the question should or could have been posed, how did they get so much? Not that they didn't get it all, but it was the amount they got. Like, my father was a farmer. He wasn't a soldier. Michael Collins himself was born in a small farm down in West Cork.
Right.
And the other thing I suppose that shocked me was how a man born in poverty himself in West Cork managed to radicalise a generation.
Right.
You know, to follow him and his ideals.
Right.
To say we can achieve this freedom, we can do what we're saying we'll do.
Right.
And, you know, they were amazing people. They were
Absolutely.
amazing.
I mean, I often compare, like, the deal that Collins made back then, which was the best deal possible at the time. I compare it to the Good Friday Agreement, which was 25 years ago. So we have 25 years of peace. And Gerry Adams and Bill Clinton were here in New York last night to commemorate that 25 years of peace. But the Collins Agreement in itself was, Good Friday is, with all the education, all the influence, all the negotiators, is just a more modern version of it. Would you agree with that?
But if you look back 100 years back now, with the might of America behind us, the might of Europe behind us, we can't solve the Northern Protocol, which is really only paperwork, not about territory at all. It's about paperwork of bringing goods outside the EU into the EU and all that. So, like, when you look back with that hindsight, you say, my God Almighty, how did they get so much? Exactly. Now, the only difference with my father joined with Collins in the Civil War, but my father was a 32-county Republican, as was Michael Collins.
Right.
But they knew the only way to achieve that was to take the 26 first.
Right.
Now, that's my reason.
Negotiate, yeah.
And then negotiate the rest. But if instead of shooting at ourselves in the Civil War, if we gathered up our momentum and maybe make a final push, whatever was to be done. But my father was always, and that brought him to bad conflict with his Cumann Gael friends
Yeah.
after, because
Right.
that's another part. But like, to think of what they achieved,
Right.
to think of what they achieved, like England had been negotiating with France and America, they had been used to negotiations for hundreds of years. And there we had a group of people that sat down, and like what people fail to forget, the border hasn't moved a millimetre since,
No.
up or down. So if it was a bad deal then, is it a bad deal now? And you know, when you look at it like that and you take the thing, but it's absolutely fantastic that we have peace.
Oh, I
You
agree.
know,
The 25
peace,
years, indeed.
no matter what conflict, the only way to end it is to sit around the table and
Talk, yeah. Well, my
And
podcast is called It's Good to Talk.
I want to give all due credit to the people that put the deal together for the Good Friday Agreement. That was an amazing deal to put together. You sat down opposing factions, and it is the only way. It is the only consultation, not confrontation.
Yeah. My podcast is called It's Good to Talk. My guest is Gerry Coyle, and we're talking about a book he has produced called Henry Coyle, and it's a fine production. A few months back, I had Philip Irvin from Glenamoy, and I had Brian Layden, and we were talking about the Battle of Glenamoy in 1922. And Brian is a historian, and I just agreed with Gerry that the Michael Collins deal that was hashed out back then, the Good Friday Agreement, is like a follow-on to that in retrospect. But De Valera, who was born here in Manhattan in Lexington Avenue, so he wasn't even Irish at all. He was known as the Spanish onion in the Irish stew, because he screwed it up when Collins went back. Collins had the deal made, and De Valera said no deal. He woke up and said no deal, and that was the cause of the problem, basically then. And then it brought Michael Collins to his demise. Continue, Gerry.
Yeah, the civil war that took place was a major tragedy, and there was complete and utter devastation on both sides. Like, both sides didn't behave well in war, you know. But what the English couldn't do, they managed to do themselves, to kill Michael Collins or to take him out of the equation, because they knew he was the brains behind it. And how tragic is that? And when you're reading the book there, a man that was involved in the smashing of the van in Scotland in another case, it was McCarthy that led the operation that killed that fella in Sligo. But like, what shocked me too, John, was not just the bits, the way these people were treated after, or should I say mistreated after. And whatever way the men were treated, the women were completely and utterly mistreated. They got no pensions, they pleaded for pensions. You know, you had Kate Lee writing to the pension board for my father's address. Now, they had my father's address because they had refused him so many times the pension himself. Did they give it to her? No.
No.
They gave her no.
Yeah, I was reading some of those requests in the book here, you know.
Yeah.
And I must say, when you mentioned about education, your father seemingly was a well-educated guy. I was looking at the handwriting and the way he worded, it's like top-notch.
Yeah.
I mean, truly.
There's a huge difference between education and intelligence. But somewhere along life's merry way, they got mixed up.
Yeah.
Like you meet them every day. You meet workers. You meet very. You take the Irish that went abroad back on the cotton ships. They went without any education, but they had something more important with them. They had intelligence.
Right.
And it was when the intelligence met the education, it was onwards and upwards for the Irish abroad.
Right.
And what people tend to forget too, John, in that particular instant, look at what they have achieved. The most powerful nation in the world will block the streets of the biggest cities in the world for the Irish to march up on St. Patrick's Day.
True.
That's a testament to the blood, sweat and tears of the Americans, and it should never be forgotten.
Never be forgotten. It just brings me to maybe a humorous point from a man down your way, Pat Lindsay, right?
Yeah.
Pat Lindsay was a barrister, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if he was a relation of yours or not.
He was just next door.
Okay.
He's mentioned in the book there.
There's a great story that I remember clearly from way back of Pat Lindsay having to represent a tinker woman who had poisoned her husband. Now, the husband allegedly was very abusive to her, so she just put the poison into a cup of tea and she got rid of him. But unfortunately, she was caught brought to Castlebar Court, and Pat Lindsay had to represent her. And in fairness, back then, I guess the system knew the husband was a bad guy, and the woman, in fairness, was almost entitled to kill him. After the court, Pat Lindsay came out on the steps, and the media, like today, were all chasing him, and they were saying, Mr. Lindsay, do you honestly believe that that tinker woman was innocent? And Pat Lindsay said, well, I'll put it this way, he said, I wouldn't take a cup of tea from her, okay? But he won the case.
There's lots of stories, but it's sad the way they were treated, but to move on with my father's story, my father was eventually caught the Friday night after they burned the warehouses. He was caught in Scotland, which was then, and I think still is, the largest amount of illegal explosives and guns ever found on the British mainland, being transported in an old Austin car that was given a lot of trouble to them. And they were finally caught. They got a severe beating on the road to tell the police wanted to find out where they got the stuff and where they were going with it. And they both refused. There was a young lad named Charles Strickland with them. He called himself McGinn. He called himself after his mother's name. Some say it was to protect his family back in Belfast. Others say the boys were given a bit of jibing about a famous landlord man that was here in Mayo, Strickland, and he changed the name from Strickland to McGinn. But he was a wonderful character too, and I have made contact with his relatives as well. But they were caught outside Alloa. I was in it the other day, Alloa in Scotland. They were taken in and they were tried, but the police traced the car back to Liverpool. It had been fixed there when they were connecting the paraffin and when he was delivering stuff down. And they took him from the prison in Scotland, brought him to Liverpool, and he was tried in Liverpool for the burning of the warehouses as well. But he got away with that. But of course there wasn't much defence you could put up when you were caught in a car with a car load of
caught red-handed,
And he was convicted in Scotland in March 1921. The 19th of March 1921, he was sentenced to 5 years in Peterhead prison. That was where he made the famous speech from the dock that was carried in all the papers. And he spent 11 months in the notorious hellhole, as himself called it, the hellhole of a prison in Peterhead, along with lots of others. And they got out with the treaty. That's another thing that was forgot about the treaty, the amount of prisoners that got out because of the treaty. And in June 1922, he got married in Scotland in the uniform of the Irish Republic. I think that was part of the reason that the picture and the story was on the New York Times.
Right.
It actually featured.
That's a picture I was going to say, yeah.
It's in the book.
Okay.
The picture featured on the New York Times that he was in the presence of 10 more Irish soldiers at the wedding, and a large crowd of people gathered waving Sinn Féin flags. But the actual flags that were shaking was the Irish tricolour. Was the tricolour flags they had outside the church when they came out.
Right.
And that was 2 days before the Four Crofts were bombarded with the Civil War. And then that day he was presented with a silver teapot. And the teapot now, for any of your listeners, is in the GPO in Dublin, in the museum in the GPO in Dublin. It's item number 14 if people want to go down to see it.
Right.
Please God, I'm making an arrangement. They don't have the picture, but I'm making an arrangement to present them with a copy of the picture to put in along with the teapot to show.
Yeah, the GPO is the post office, and the big post office in Dublin, yeah.
Yeah, the GPO is the place that the Easter Rising started in, and it's a very famous piece of infrastructure in Ireland. So if any of your listeners
that sounds good.
But that's the way they were. They were just amazing people. But a lot of tragedy befell him after his wife died, and they had one daughter, and his daughter was going to be taken off him because he was, I suppose, a terrorist to them people. But he smuggled the child back here to Ireland, and she was reared with his sister. And he eventually married my mother, who was nearly 22 years younger than him.
Right.
And there was 9 of us in this family then.
You're the youngest, obviously.
Yeah, but despite all the stuff I told you, despite him, he left his own hospital bed to go to Dublin for Michael Collins' funeral. The picture is in the book with him carrying the coffin. Despite all that, there was 9 of us raided in 2 rooms afterwards.
No, I from reading the book as well, I find an amazing man indeed. But he seemed to have like a jovial outlook as well, despite all the hardship and everything else.
But the one thing I want to tell your listeners too, John, it's something on the book. No matter if you have bad chapters in your life, and you can have very bad chapters in the life,
right?
It doesn't and should not prevent you from being a great person after. Because my father might have made mistakes in his life, but he made no mistake as a father. He was a wonderful man. Yeah. And whatever about him, my mother was his saving grace. Because my mother, he told a judge one time it was his 54th time in the dock. But after he met my mother, he was never in the dock after.
Yeah,
yeah. She seemed to turn his life around. And, you know, even though there was a big age difference, she sadly passed away 6 months before he did. You know, so, like, she was an amazing woman too. And how she managed to feed us all and look after us as well as she did is amazing.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book, and especially he was in one of the jails he was in. He wrote a song, and it's written and sung to the ear of
Mountains of Morden. That's when he was in Peterhead.
Yeah.
Do you want me to read it for your listeners?
What's that?
Do you want me to read it for them?
Yeah, please do, yeah.
He wrote this when he was in Peterhead convict prison in Scotland, you know. And it's based on the Mountains of Morden, the air of that song. Oh, Mary, this prison is a wonderful sight where the screws are on duty by day and by night, with a guard for to watch you when you're in your cell. If you speak to the bench, the chief he will tell. I was speaking myself when he happened to pass, and I was reported and lost amongst class. Sure, it makes me feel happy when I'm all alone to have a short crack with my mate on the phone. You remember my comrade Charles McGinn? Well, you scarcely would know him, he's getting so thin. The food we are getting, it is very bad, and the porridge at night is driving us mad. McGinn declares that the prison he will wreck, and all of the prisoners he will bring out on strike. And when he is at leisure at his time, and his time it is spent telling the tale to his mate through the bench. The great Kenan Thompson, we have him up here. He's been a chaplain of the prison for many's the year. The nags gather round him to pray and to sing, but the rebels refuse to pray for the king. What a beautiful sight those rebels to see when they go for a walk down along the North Sea, with the guard for to watch you, for fear you'd escape with his little pea shooter in under his cape. And I'll tell you, I'm longing by Mary to see when an Irish Republic established will be.
That's beautiful, well written, and
the other one is the in motor car. I have it. He wrote the Sinn Féin motor car when he was taken to Liverpool to stand trial for the burnings of the warehouses after caught in a law, and he wrote what he called the Sinn Féin motor car. I can recite that one too. I have it here.
Yeah, give us that one too. Now that we're here.
Well, when we're on, we might as well let rip.
Yeah.
It's called the Sinn Féin motor car. I suppose it summarises what was going on at the time with him. It was on the 4th of December, a motoring I did go. I steered my course to Fifeshire, I'll have you all to know, to help my faithful comrades who are fighting in the war, and to strike a blow for Ireland with the Sinn Féin motor car. I said unto our volunteers, this day I'm going to see what I can do for my country and to set old Ireland free, to drive out the tans and tyrants who were making on this war, and to fight for dear old Ireland with the Sinn Féin motor car. I had a faithful comrade, young Charles Strickland. Our firm determination was to free our native land, but coming back that very night we did receive a scare while working for old Ireland with the Sinn Féin motor car. The police in Alloa and the car that did surround and told us we would never more set foot on Irish ground. Though threatened with execution, battered, bruised and bleeding on the country road, we refused to tell the secrets as to where we got our load. Early next morning we were charged before the bar for breaking the law in Scotland with a Sinn Féin motor car. One day in the Glasgow prison, a stranger there I spied. The governor said, you must come out to be identified. Said he, I'm an English chief constable and I've travelled very far. to see this dangerous rebel and his Sinn Féin motor car.
Excellent.
He said, Coyle, you have conspired with people we do not know. You've tried to ruin our country and our government to overthrow. You brought guns and explosives to Liverpool and paraffin in a jar, and you tried to burn our cities down with your Sinn Féin motor car. They drove me off to England, my trial there to stand, for being an Irish rebel from dear old Ireland. And now I'm in a prison cell, a prisoner of war, for possessing high explosives in a Sinn Féin motor car. But God will grant my liberty, for that I always pray, and hope to meet the tyrants upon a future day. Although they've got me this time, I feel not wound nor scar, and I will fight again for Ireland with the Sinn Féin motor car.
Excellent, well done. So my podcast is called It's Good to Talk. My guest is Gerry Coyle, and we're discussing this fine production of a book all about his father, Henry Coyle. Getting back to the scenery and the landscape that your father said was beautiful but wouldn't put food on the table. At Gisala, many things happened. The horse racing is an event. Is that still going on?
Oh, it's huge, yeah. It's huge.
Yeah, right.
We're back. We were back the first time last year after COVID. The biggest crowd we ever had. We had opened up the fields. Gisala is very famous for a few things. We have the famous boxing club.
I want to get to the boxing club, yeah.
We have. We had also. There was a famous writer in Gisala. He wrote the Playboy of the Western World in the old, but turned out to be the hotel there now, the Ellis Coast Hotel, which is beautiful. My own nephew has done it up there last year, and his work partner, John Joe Joyce. And John Milton Singh wrote part of the Playboy of the Western World, and it was from that we copied the thing about the races, because he's talking about racing on the strand with horses. So the racing is a huge success. It has been on CNN in America.
Good stuff.
They have done. We've got coverage on Sky and Irish International Television, and all that's been great.
And I must reach out to your nephews here in Chicago. They're famous boxers too. So I'll have to track one of those guys down for a podcast as well. So Gerry,
well, my own son was the world military champion. He was the Irish senior champion. He was Henry Coyle as well. The difference with him and his grandfather, he fought with gloves, and his grandfather fought with guns. But they both fought for Ireland. But he won the World Military Games down in Pretoria in South Africa. And Donald Barrett won the World Peace Games in Canada. And Kira Ginty won in Azerbaijan a World Youth title. So, we punch above our weight, when it comes
that's very good, that's excellent. And like slowly and little by little, without the bomb or the bullet, the United Ireland is looking to get closer and closer, especially since Britain decided to leave Europe and they kind of forgot about the back garden, Northern Ireland, and the big mistake they made there. And another mistake that I want to highlight, that I don't think anybody has mentioned to date, is the Falkland Islands off the coast of Argentina. A population of only maybe 3,000 or 4,000. And Thatcher did what she did there at a huge expense to everybody and no great gain. I'm worried about the sheep in the Falkland Islands. Are they not getting any subsidies from Europe now if they're no longer part of Europe?
Well, it was, in my opinion, it was the biggest mistake they ever made. Okay. And it even came more home to me there last week when what was called the Windsor Agreement, and Richie Sunak went to Northern Ireland, and he said, Northern Ireland couldn't have it better. They can trade with Europe, they can trade with the Irish Republic, they can trade with England. They're in a great position. And I thought to myself, wasn't that what you were doing before you voted yourself out? So
that's true.
But then why the buses are held up at Dover, they want the benefits. Like the ironic thing about it, and a lot of the unionists in Northern Ireland are now applying for Irish passports because they can travel through Europe a lot easier with them than they can with English passport.
Yeah, it was a ridiculous.
It was a bad mistake. When you think of it, like there was no war until this war started in Europe for 75 years. In my father's time, in your father's time, millions of people died in a war in Europe. Before the pandemic, you could go any place in Europe. You wouldn't come home with Ebola, cholera, malaria, or anything like that. But then they decide to leave. Like thousands of people die in the Mediterranean every year trying to enter Europe, and they think they have it when they're here. Right. I do joke with English people when they come back and they say, "Welcome to Europe."
Yeah.
It was a bad market. Yeah. It was sad how it came about, and in fairness, David Cameron was a great leader. It was an awful mistake he made to have a referendum at all, or to promise that referendum. It shouldn't have happened.
It only won by short margin. But
Sure.
I blame the guy with the red hair, Boris
All
Johnson.
sure,
We
you
just-
know. Sure.
But anyways,
He had two speeches made in his pocket. He didn't know which one he was going to use. Was it going to be pro or anti Europe? And then he decided at the last minute to vote against. Crazy stuff. But look at
but
you know,
Sinn Féin,
the English people have had it tough now. Talking to France there for Easter, the buses were held up at Dover for miles back out, and they're wondering what's wrong because all the paperwork you have to go through.
yeah, but Sinn Féin. My guest is Gerry Coyle today. My podcast is called It's Good to Talk. And Gerry, it's a great production. I see, getting back to it again, like the amount of research you put in here, and it seems like you travel to libraries and prisons and all over. You put a lot of hard work into it. I commend you for that. Where can people buy this book?
Well, it's on mayobooks.ie. They can get it online on mayobooks.ie. You just contact them, send them an email. They'll send it any place in the world to you. You know, Mayo Books in Castlebar, mayobooks.ie.
Okay.
You can get it there. I mean to have a launch in America sometime. I was going to do it before Christmas in Chicago.
Well, we'd be delighted to have you.
I couldn't get them. I couldn't get the books sent out. Actually, it was very difficult to get.
Well, I have a copy here now.
But a box of them are 16 kilos. Like you know, they're heavy per box to get shipped. But
when it comes to moving it, it's a little lifting, yeah.
I was paying a tribute to the man. It was never about making money from the sales of the book.
I understand.
The records needed to be set straight with what happened to him afterwards, how he fell out with the establishment. Like Henry Coyle could fight with guns, but not with politics.
Yeah.
And it was his downfall in the end, being elected. He was elected to the Dáil. He's the only man that ever was or ever will be debarred from the Dáil. Because you can be bankrupt now, you can kill somebody, you cannot be barred from the Dáil. Once you serve your time, you can go back in. That time you couldn't.
Right, Gerry. Well, Sinn Féin, I'm a member of the Mayo Society here in New York, and Betty Aaron from Glenamai is a good friend of mine, my nephew Kieran McAndrew. So at the next meeting, which is only a week from today, I'll be bringing it up that we promote this book because it's Mayo and it's a fine production. And the Mayo Society would be delighted to meet you when you come over here and do a launch. And if there's anything we can do on this side, we're extending the hand of gratitude and welcome. And we'll be rolling out the red carpet for this book. Gerry, I think we have talked because it's good to talk and it's good to listen. So, Gerry, I'm going to say goodbye to you for now, okay?
It's great to talk. And as I said, no matter what people go through in their lives, they can turn it around and be great people afterwards. And that's what people to take from this book. Thank you, John, for having me on. And I'd be delighted to extend the hand of friendship to you when we see you.
Yes, absolutely. Our pleasure. Gerry, thank you once again. Son Gafol.